The Missouri Ozarks have a silence that settles deep, like dust on forgotten things. In the early 1930s, along the edge of the current river, there was a house that no one liked to look at for too long. It leaned a little to one side, its roof sagging, its windows staring out through a wall of pine trees. People said it belonged to the Wild sisters, Alma, Ruth, and the youngest, Clara. 3 women living alone in a place where the land itself seemed to whisper. They rarely came to town, and when they did, they moved like shadows that knew too much. At dusk, when the fog lifted off the river, folks swore they heard singing, soft at first, like a prayer carried on the wind, then stronger, clearer, weaving through the trees. Some said it was beautiful, others said it sounded too sweet to be human. Travelers passing through claimed the sisters would wave from their porch, offering food, a warm bed, or a drink to wash the road from their throats. No one could ever describe their faces quite right afterward, just that their eyes were pale, and their smiles didn't seem to reach them. In the fall of 1932, a trapper heading north stopped for a meal. He was never seen again. A few months later, a farmhand disappeared on his way to Springfield. Then a third man, a traveling salesman, vanished after telling a friend he planned to spend the night near the river bend. Each time the townsfolk whispered, and each time the sheriff rode out to the wild house. He'd come back pale, shaking his head, saying he found nothing but empty rooms and the faint smell of flowers. Still, no one dared to question him. By the time winter came, the stories grew teeth. Children were warned not to wander near the river. Hunters refused to set traps in those woods. They said the sisters weren't just strange, they were cursed. Some believed they were witches who'd made a pact to keep men close forever. Others said they were just lonely women driven mad by the silence. Then one night, a fisherman pulled something from the river that made him drop his net and run. The sheriff wrote a final report not long after, 4 words: no further search advised. After that, the wild house was left to rot beneath the pines, its chimney crumbling, its porch swallowed by vines. But when the wind shifts across the current river, some still swear they hear 3 voices singing, a song too soft to remember and too haunting to forget. Kindness can wear a strange face in a lonely place. That's what people said about the Wild sisters. For years they seemed harmless. 3 women living at the edge of the world, baking bread for passing workers, offering whiskey to travelers who had nowhere else to go. Ruth would laugh easily, Alma would listen closely, and little Clara would hum while she poured the drinks. They were polite, generous even, but there was something in their eyes that made men uneasy, something that flickered like a candle just before it goes out. In the autumn of 1934, a young salesman from St. Louis came through town. He was bright, confident, the kind of man who could sell snow in January. He told the grocer he was headed north by dawn, but when morning came, his car was still parked near the weeds behind the wild house, the front seat covered in dew. Alma told anyone who asked that he had left before sunrise, walking toward town, but no one saw him. Days passed, and the smell of iron began to drift from behind their chicken coop. Ruth said they were butchering, but no one remembered them ever keeping livestock. At night, people began to hear things. A low scraping sound from across the river, the faint cry of an animal that didn't sound quite right. Someone swore they saw light flickering beneath the house, as if lanterns were burning underground. But when the sheriff finally came, everything looked calm. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, and 3 women greeted him with smiles. He searched the rooms and the cellar, even stepped out back where the earth looked newly turned. Ruth told him they were planting bulbs for spring. He wrote it down and left, though he couldn't shake the sound that followed him all the way to his horse, the faint hum of a hymn, slow and steady, coming from the trees. Weeks later, another traveler arrived, a preacher from Arkansas. He was on his way to Springfield, carrying a worn Bible and a sermon about temptation. He spent one night at the wild house, grateful for the shelter. He never reached his next church. His horse was found wandering near the bridge, reins snapped clean. The sheriff went back once more. He said he heard singing before he even reached the porch. 3 voices, blending so perfectly that it sounded almost holy. He called out, but no one answered. He knocked louder each time, until the sound echoed into the woods. Still, the singing didn't stop. It just grew softer, like it was sinking into the ground. He left before sunset, refusing to look back. By winter, the Wild sisters stopped baking bread. The laughter that once floated through their yard was gone. But sometimes, when the river ran low, townsfolk swore they could smell iron again, like blood warming in the cold air, carried by the wind that never forgot where it came from. By 1935, the Wild house was no longer a home. It was a warning, the kind of place mothers mentioned in hushed voices when their children wandered too close to the river. Even the wind seemed to change when it passed over that land, softer, slower, like it was listening. Children from town would dare each other to run up to the porch and touch the door. Most never made it past the gate. Those who did swore they saw something shift in the shadows beneath the house, something wrapped in burlap, something that moved just enough to prove it wasn't sleeping. The sisters kept to themselves. Ruth was often seen at the well, drawing water before dawn, her dress damp to the knees. Alma sat on the porch with a sewing basket, her hands always busy, her eyes fixed on the trees. Clara wandered the yard, humming to herself, burying small glass jars in the dirt. No one knew why. The people in town said their mother had been the same way, strange, quiet, always feeding the ground with scraps from her table, whispering words that no one understood. They said she could calm storms, heal fevers, and make the river rise or fall just by speaking to it. But when a baby died of fever one summer, the townsfolk turned on her. They called her a witch and burned her garden to ash. She vanished soon after. Some believed her daughters were all that was left. Others said she never really left at all. That spring, a farmer's dog started digging along the Wild property line. When the dog came back carrying something white, the farmer thought it was bone from an old deer. But when he looked closer, he saw the shape of a jaw, teeth still in place. He took it to town, hands shaking. The sheriff promised to look into it, but the next morning, the bone was gone from his office shelf. Later that week, the farmer's barn caught fire. It burned so fast, the sky turned orange before anyone could reach it. When the flames died, Ruth Wild was seen standing at her gate, her face lit by the embers. She smiled when the farmer looked her way and said, "The river gives and takes, we only help it along." After that, no one said her name out loud. Children stopped playing near the bridge. Travelers began taking the long road around. Even the birds seemed to avoid the trees near the property. The Wild sisters' yard grew wild again, the earth too dark, too soft, as if it had been turned too many times. And on quiet nights, when the moon dipped low over the current river, some swore they heard whispering from beneath the porch, like someone calling out from under the ground, asking to be covered again. In the summer of 1937, a new face appeared in the quiet Missouri town. Henry Barlow, a young investigator from Springfield. He carried a brown leather satchel, a sharp mind, and little patience for ghost stories. The case of the Wild sisters had been left to rot in the county archives, buried beneath dust and rumor. But Barlow believed in evidence, not whispers. He told the sheriff he intended to close the file for good, to bring truth where superstition had made a home. The sheriff only nodded and said, "Be careful what truth you dig for in this town." For 3 nights, Barlow stayed at the old boarding house near the square, a place that smelled of tobacco and rain. He sat beneath a flickering lamp, poring over the missing persons reports, his notes filling page after page. The timelines didn't match. Witnesses contradicted each other. Names were misspelled. Statements unfinished. Even the sheriff's handwriting grew shaky halfway through the file, as if his hand refused to finish the story. Barlow circled every inconsistency, convinced it was all just human error, fear making fools of ordinary men. On the fourth morning, he set out for the wild property. Locals watched from their porches as he crossed the wooden bridge that divided the town from the forest. His hat was tilted low, his boots kicking up dust. He didn't notice how the air grew still once he passed the tree line, or how even the river's current seemed to slow. Someone said they saw him stop halfway across the bridge, looking down at the water as if hearing something beneath it. But he kept walking. That night, a storm rolled in from the east. The wind carried strange sounds through the valley. Laughter that didn't belong to anyone they knew, followed by something else. It wasn't quite screaming. More like singing, stretched too far, like a hymn unraveling in the dark. People locked their doors, drew their curtains, and waited for morning. When the sun came up, Henry Barlow's car was found by the roadside near the bridge. The engine was still running, its low hum blending with the sound of insects waking in the heat. The driver's door hung open. His hat lay in the dirt a few feet away, rain-soaked and muddy. Inside his coat pocket, folded neatly, was a torn page from a hymn book. The words were smudged, but one line could still be read, "And he shall gather them to the river." The paper was stiff, stained with something dark, something that had dried overnight. The sheriff arrived before noon, stared at the car for a long time, then ordered it to be towed back into town. He refused to send anyone to the wild property. "Let the river keep what it's taken," he said. That evening, as the sun sank behind the pines, a few townsfolk claimed they saw 3 figures standing on the porch across the water, their dresses billowing in the wind. They weren't moving, just watching, waiting. After Henry Barlow vanished, fear seeped through the town like smoke through old boards. The sheriff, pale and trembling, could no longer ignore the whispers. Within days, men from the county arrived with rifles and lanterns, crossing the bridge that most swore they'd never set foot on. They moved toward the wild property in silence, boots sinking into wet ground, the smell of the river thick in the air. When they reached the house, the door stood open. Inside, the air was heavy, sour, and still. The parlor was littered with empty jars and broken glass. A dozen cages lined the wall, filled with small bones picked clean. Flies gathered in the corners, humming like a low, angry choir. Upstairs, the beds were stripped bare, sheets stained dark, as if soaked in something that had been washed away too late. One deputy found a collection of glass jars, stacked neatly on a dresser, each labeled in careful handwriting, heart, tongue, hand. He dropped one, and the smell that filled the room made him gag. But it was the cellar that silenced them all. The steps were slick, the air thick with rot. Their lanterns trembled as they descended into the dark. The floor was damp, covered in soil that gleamed black like oil. In the corner sat Clara, the youngest sister, her dress clinging to her like wet paper. She rocked back and forth, her lips moving, her voice barely more than breath. "They told me to stay," she whispered. "They told me to keep singing." Her eyes were open, but she wasn't seeing them. Ruth and Alma were nowhere to be found. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no trace of departure. Only that heavy soil, disturbed in strange circular patterns, as though something had been buried and dug up again and again. When asked where her sisters had gone, Clara just smiled and said, "They're still here. They don't leave. Not the ones who stayed too long." The sheriff ordered the place sealed. But before the men left, they noticed the sound of water dripping from the ceiling, though there were no pipes above, only the floorboards of the house. They covered the cellar entrance and nailed the door shut. 2 days later, the town preacher held a cleansing service, determined to rid the place of its evil. He didn't finish his sermon. Mid-sentence, his voice broke, and he began to cough, first dust, then dirt, until he fell to his knees, choking. He never spoke again. The sheriff declared the land cursed and boarded the property off. Yet on still nights, when the wind rolled low across the current river, people swore they heard their names whispered, drawn out slow and careful, as if someone on the other side of the water was calling for them to come closer, just a little closer. By the summer of 1972, the river had swallowed nearly everything that once marked the wild property. The porch had rotted away, the chimney stood crooked, and the forest had grown thick enough to hide the past. But when the state announced plans for a new bridge, the land was disturbed for the first time in decades. The workers joked about curses and ghosts as their machines tore through the soil, laughing until one of the backhoes hit something that didn't sound like stone. It was hollow, brittle. When the dust cleared, a pale shape gleamed beneath the mud, a bone, then another, and another. The sheriff's department arrived within the hour, followed by men from the state capitol. By the second day, the crew had uncovered what looked like a shallow graveyard, dozens of bones tangled together, ribs curving into ribs, skulls lying face down in the dirt. The air smelled of wet rust and decay that hadn't quite finished dying. Forensics later confirmed at least 12 victims, all male, spanning nearly a decade. Some had been buried whole, others in pieces. The earth had kept them close, as if the river refused to let them go. Among the fragments was something that made even the old deputies go still. A tarnished badge, bent at the edge, with the faint letters H. Barlow scratched into the back. The name everyone thought had vanished into the trees nearly 40 years earlier. It was proof at last. The Wild Sisters weren't just a story whispered over campfires. They were real, and they had been feeding the earth long before anyone dared to believe it. Within days, the Ozarks were overrun by reporters. They called it the Sirens of the Current, a story that sounded too strange to be true, too old to be forgotten. Newspapers printed the sisters' faces side by side, using the last surviving photograph from a church picnic. They looked ordinary, almost gentle, as if they could have been anyone's neighbors. But the eyes were the same, cold, pale, unblinking. Old townsfolk told their versions to whoever would listen. They spoke of music that drifted through the trees every spring, of hymns that carried across the water when the moon was full. Some remembered the smell of bread, others remembered the silence that followed. The stories were all the same in one way. No one ever saw Ruth or Alma again. Some said they fled north, living under new names. Others claimed they walked into the river hand in hand and never came back. But no bodies ever surfaced. Only the water kept moving, slow, dark, and patient, as if it still had more secrets to bring up. Today, nothing remains of the wild house but fragments of stone swallowed by ivy and time. The river has crept closer over the years, as if trying to reclaim what it once helped hide. The old path that led to the porch is now a slick trail of mud, and the only sound most days is the slow drip of water through the trees. But when night falls, the air feels different there, heavier, like it's listening for something. Urban explorers come with cameras and flashlights, chasing the ghosts of a story that refuses to die. They whisper as they walk, their breath fogging in the dark, careful not to disturb the silence. Yet, when they play back their recordings later, the silence isn't silent at all. You can hear it, faint and far away, the sound of voices humming soft and low, like a hymn being sung through water. A woman's laughter follows, light at first, then sharp, cutting through the static. Some swear they hear footsteps sloshing through the mud beside them, though the cameras show no one there. One video caught a figure in the tree line, its outline distorted, its shape shifting with the light. When the explorers turned to look, nothing moved, but the sound of singing grew louder, rising like breath from the river itself. Recently, state archaeologists reopened the site after heavy rains, uncovered new bone fragments. What they found unsettled even the most rational among them. DNA results revealed something impossible, traces of both male and female markers fused within the same remains, as if time or something older had blurred the lines between them. The samples didn't match any known pattern. One report quietly noted that the structure of the cells showed unusual cohesion, as if the dead refused to separate from one another. The files were sealed within weeks. But the people who live nearby still talk. They say the land is alive, that it hums when the river is low. The older generation calls it the promise, a curse born from love twisted too far. Folklore says Ruth and Alma made a pact the night before the law came, that love would never leave their land, even if it meant consuming it whole. They say the river took them body and soul, binding their names to the men they had buried, until the water and the blood became one. Some nights, when the moon leans close to the current river, the water turns still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. Stand there long enough, they say, and you'll hear the voices. Women singing slow and sweet, their words lost to time. And sometimes, if the wind is right, another sound answers, deeper, distant and human, the kind of voice that shouldn't still exist, calling from beneath the water, as if love had never stopped reaching back.